go over our last chapter, chapter 15. This is our last class, and so we will cover death and dying. Despite what that popular television show that there's 1,000 ways to die, in reality, there's 3 pathways to death. Pathway 1 occurs suddenly. It's like an accident. It's say a heart attack. It's a fast one. So that television show, 1,000 Ways to Die, actually goes over like the different ways that you could, have pathway 1 essentially. Pathway 2 is, as you can see, a steady decline, and then death occurs. And this is usually like a terminal illness, a terminal diagnosis, cancer, ALS, things like that. So the person steadily declines and then they pass away. Pathway 3 is, first of all, the number one way that people, especially in the United States, pass away nowadays. But for the most part, most people pass away on pathway 3. And this is where it's kind of this long, drawn out, and here it says erratic. So, it's up and then something happens and you decline, and then maybe you go to the hospital and they fix you up, and then over time, the person starts to decline again, and then some medicine maybe helps them, and then ultimately they pass away. You see this with really our chronic illnesses, congestive heart failure, cancers that can be treated, and then it kind of goes away, and then it comes back, and so on. AIDS, we say that people pass away this way because they get sick, and we can kind of fix them up and help them a little bit, and then ultimately the the body just gets to the point where it can't fight anymore. So you start to see this like usually in elderly people. Their health is just declining, and then they might have some repeated hospital admissions, and ultimately we know that the end of life is it's at some point probably coming up pretty soon. A little bit about a history of dying, and I know that this is not the most pleasant of conversations. However, it's important, and especially how so many of you all are going into the health field. It's important to discuss the death process. It's important for you all just in your own lives to have this conversation with people too. So a little bit about the history of dying. A long time ago, death was essentially in our faces. It was everywhere. It happened a lot, right? People passed away from infectious diseases. Children and young adults and just everybody. It was something that occurred quite often. It wasn't only elderly people. And we talked about death a lot. Children knew all about it because the doctor would come to the house, and maybe mom was upstairs in the bedroom sick, and maybe she would pass away. And it literally was in our homes. Then, with modern medicine and modern technology and industrialization and so on, we had where death was sort of removed from the process. And you didn't see it as much because doctors had offices and hospitals. So when a patient was sick, they would go to the hospital. And so then that's where death occurred. And so death was removed from the community. It was removed from our sight, if you want to think of it that way. And so you know, and when that happened, then it was removed from conversation, and we hushed it. We didn't talk about it. You certainly wouldn't talk about it with children. And I think at this point we're still kind of reeling from that idea that it's something that you don't talk about. And and it really shouldn't be that way, because I hate to break it to you, but it's going to happen to everybody. And if we're not talking about it, then it's scary. And you know, we're always scared of the unknown, right? So so it should be talked about more. And people who are undergoing a terminal illness, then, you know, we need to have conversations with them, and not just avoid the topic because we feel like it's going to be uncomfortable. So this is just, you know, in other parts of the world, obviously, death is viewed a lot differently compared to here, maybe in the Western world. So lots of different cultures do different things with their deceased, or the process of passing away. I like this one because they believe that they need to gather around the individual, and everybody needs to touch the individual that's passing away, and that will help them, you know, pass on to a better world, and that evil spirits won't come into our world. So that's kind of an interesting culture. Kubler-Ross, she came around in the 60s, and she was saying, you know, that we really needed to open up this dialogue of death and dying, and the dying process, and the death process, and the grief process. And so she really, you know, is very well known for those 5 stages of grief. And so let's talk a little bit about that, right? So these are Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. Of course, this could be the person going through the death process, and it can also be the family members of that person. So denial, right? They just deny that it's happening. They get angry. It's very common to see people kind of bargain, right? Saying things like, if you just let me live, I promise I'll be a better person. Or if you just let me live, I'll take my medications and I'll take care of myself, and so on. So some sort of bargaining with a higher being. Depression makes sense, right? We understand that one. And ultimately, in theory, that we just kind of accept what's happening, and we move on. Kubler-Ross, these 5 stages of grief get a lot of, definitely a lot of publicity, but I think it's important to know that it's a little bit misguided. And we want you to know that, first and foremost, not everybody goes through these stages in this order. Okay, it doesn't mean that everyone's going to go here and then they're going to become angry and then they're going to start bargaining. So we do not see it just happen in that order. Some people don't experience all 5 stages. So someone may never be in denial. They might spend the rest of their time in anger. You know, some people may only be depressed, or some people might just be like, yeah, it is what it is. And in theory, you can maybe just accept it. So if you don't go through those stages, if you don't see the stages happening, that's okay, right? It doesn't mean that anything is wrong. The other thing that's important is we certainly don't want to diminish someone's feelings to a stage. It's sort of, I don't know, it just takes away from the validity of their feelings if we just say, oh, they're going through a stage, okay? So some people don't like that idea. We don't like that they would, you know, just, oh, it's a stage kind of mentality. Let's see. So, here's some of the problems, right? The other, some people that are terminally ill may not want to discuss their illness, and they may not want to discuss their death. And this is important to know, just moving forward in life, because, say somebody close to you has a terminal illness, and they know that they're going to pass away. They may not want to talk about it, and it's not because they're in denial. It's because they don't want that to be the only thing that you remember of them. They might find joy in hearing about you, in hearing about your stories and what's happening in your life, and not want to kind of ruin, if you want to think of it that way. It's kind of a bad word, but they don't want to ruin that memory of it only being a sad time. Okay. Not every culture feels that it's appropriate. And of course, not everybody passes through those distinct stages. Okay. So obviously, people can experience many emotions, and they can be all over the place. And so we just want to be careful with those kind of prescribing to that very strict 5 stages of grief. Elderly people, actually report that they don't have a fear of death. This doesn't make much sense to the younger people out there, but older people, they're just like, no, I'm not afraid. It's, it's going to be fine, kind of thing. And so, they may not go through those stages. Okay. Obviously anything that was not expected, a sudden death, obviously every time a youth passes away, those are particularly painful for family members and friends, and those are usually our harder deaths to get through. Okay, this is not to say that somebody who has had cancer for several years and they pass away, that's not to say that those family members aren't sad, or that they're not grieving, or, of course it is. Of course it's sad, and of course it's emotional. But usually we see that obviously sudden deaths and youth deaths are particularly hard. Guidelines for a good death. If you've ever thought about, the process and how you would want that to go down, they have asked people, and for the most part, we say that we do not want to be in pain. Right? I think if we can be free from debilitating pain, that means it's a pretty good death, right? Usually people say they want to be in as little pain as possible, right? In fact, most people say that they want to pass away in their sleep. Okay, and that one would give the idea that they would feel nothing. And then it also leads to the idea of this one, that we have maximized our psychological security and we've reduced fear and anxiety. And being asleep would be the maximum of that, right? Because you would not be aware. So therefore you would not be fearful or anxious. Okay. If you don't want to be asleep and you want to be say something like, oh, I would like to have my family around, I want to have my dogs with me, I would like to have my priest or my pastor with me, those are also ways that we can maximize psychological security. Those are ways that we can reduce fear and reduce our anxiety. Okay. Usually people want to have tied up any loose ends with relationships. They want to be close to their loved ones, and of course, if there's a religious person, they want to foster that spirituality. Okay, so I guess, if we've never thought about it before, that these would be pretty good, goals for a good death. So, At death, obviously grief, is shaped by society. And even within the United States, because we have such a mix of different cultures, we see different things. So, maybe, let's see, what do we have in the Catholic? We have the rosary, and then we have the funeral process, a mass or something like that, right? In kind of your Protestant religions, you have like a celebration of life. There are other cultures, like we said with the Hmong, where they, put their hands on the individual who's passing away. And then grief, is it going to be something that we mourn for a long time? Do we cover all the mirrors in the house? Do we have like a party and a celebration for that person? It really just depends on your culture and your society. It's very common, of course, the first months after a death for the survivors to be mourning. Ruminating is thinking over and over again about that person, about the process, right? The actual death itself, especially if it was an accident or if it was sudden or unexpected. And you can also hear people say they feel like the person is around them. They feel like their presence is there. So that's very common with survivors. After 6 months, really society is kind of telling you to move on, but the survivors don't experience that. Okay. And so sometimes you hear survivors say things like, well, the world just kept moving. Nobody stopped. The world didn't stop with me. And that's, just the idea that like society keeps going, and sometimes they expect the survivors to pick up and just keep moving along too. And that's where we have some hard time for people to kind of re-enter the workforce and things like that. After 6 months, you usually start to see a kind of easing of the symptoms. I don't want to necessarily say easing of the pain, but easing of the symptoms. In psychology, we give a person 1 year. We give them a year to go through the mourning process, and 1 year allows the individuals or the survivors to go through all of the holidays. It allows them to get through their birthday, and then it gets them to their anniversary of the death. And after a year, we would call that bereavement disorder, or like a prolonged grief process. And so if somebody is still showing heavy grief even after a year, then it might be a good idea for that person to talk to somebody to get some help.